Yanni, thank you for the introduction. And what I'm doing and what I want to discuss today is something which is in part related to my first works, but not only, because during last years, I went back to Russia for questions of serfdom, but also I'm coming back to a kind of connected history of political economy, which was somewhere in my first works about Russian economic thought in the connections with the European political economy. But also I was back to this topic during last years when I tried to work on Bentham and Bentham moving between Russia, India, and Europe, about some concerns about labor and the prisons and similar topics. So to a given extent, this piece is related to my idea of trying to connect different parts of political economy. Of course, it's a kind of patchwork. So forgive me, it's not a conventional history of intellectual history of political economy. You know, everything about, I don't know, Chayanov or something like this. It's something a little bit different. And this is related to the idea of backwardness. In other words, my idea is to start from this guy and this book that most of you know, the Gerschenkron story, and try to discuss what? I would like to discuss these questions. Why this book in the 60s? Why there is a chapter on Russia? I mean, we can take this as a simple question. If Gerschenkron came from the Russian area, of course, he had to put Russia, but this is not the good question and not the good answers, first of all. So why is there a chapter on Russia on this book to discuss something which is called backwardness? And why there is a kind of anachronism in this book, which means why can he use Russia history of the turn of the century to discuss underdevelopment during the Cold War? There was no necessity to do this way. Why he asked some questions as he asked, in other words, why, for example, he thought that we can look for some substitution factors, as he called. Why should we have something called a state to replace the bourgeoisie? And the fourth is, why was Gerschenkron there after all? Why? It's very, I like to have very banal questions, but they are not so banal. And why there was a reception, particularly a reception among the economists who considered that it was not a book in economics, and most of them already at the time contested the approach. So there are very basic questions, but to answer these questions, I not just discuss of Gerschenkron, and I try, in my opinion, to understand Gerschenkron, we must put it not just in the context of the Cold War, but the main categories used actually were inherited from a long debate and some categories that I would like to discuss with you. And my idea is to include the notion of backwardness, mostly in economic concerns. Backwardness since the Enlightenment through the end of the 20th century. At this moment, something changed, but I would like to have a very longue durée approach about backwardness. And the second, to answer the previous questions, is why the Russian case is so central in discussions on economic backwardness since the 18th century. There are many other countries who come and go, but Russia, until the moment when during last 30 years, 20 years, China took the real core of those kind of discussions with the end of backwardness. I will explain at the end. Russia was always there for some reasons that I want to explain. There was a connection between economic backwardness and discussions on Russia. And my idea is that on the European side, but I will take also the Russian side. On the European side, discussing Russia was a way of discussing the notion of modernization itself and the meaning of progress itself. Many European authors discussed Russia, but actually they were thinking about Europe. And this is important, and Gerschenkron itself. And the implicit stake was the role of political economy in the political debates. In other words, there is a tension underlying these debates about modernization, which is not just we, us, and the others. It's not just Europe and Russia, but it's Europe and Russia within a particular field, which is political economy, in which there is a tension, an epistemological tension between normativity on one side and the time scales on the other sides. I'm going to explain political economy is never only analytical. It becomes a normativity, and this is precisely where the notion of backwardness and progress enter. Without the normativity, we could not have this. And so that's why, to me, it's extremely interesting. The normativity on political economy. And inside this normativity, there is a tension, which is in a general way, the tension that you know all around the world between the so-called market and regulation, which is very broad. But in the Russian case, at the turn of the century, not before, not after, this tension becomes something peculiar. In other words, what I want to explain is that we have this tension between market and regulation, but in the Russian case, it becomes at a given point a tension between the общественность and the государственность, which is not universal. It's a particular variation of this broader tension. And I want to understand why. So we have some general concerns and some peculiarities of Russia, okay? So let's start with the 18th century. In the 18th century, the Russian case, I start with another anachronism in this case. It's not Gerschenkron, but we have to put away a different concern about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, as we see in some historiography, and if we read the French historian Marc Bloch wrote on comparative history, as you know, and in many places is considered as one of the big names for comparison. Now, Marc Bloch wrote something about serfdom, and he considered that serf de la glebe never existed because it was an invention. This was Marc Bloch, philological investigation. He said, I cannot find the expression serf de la glebe in Middle Ages sources. So he asked where the expression come from. And his answer is, it comes from Montesquieu and l'esprit des lois. So this was the interpretation of Marc Bloch. And Marc Bloch said, Montesquieu invented this when he argued that serfdom, serf de la glebe, was in the past of France, but now under the Enlightenment, even the absolutism and enlightened absolutism, there were no more serf de la glebe in France. And so this was the interpretation of Marc Bloch, but Marc Bloch actually cut the sentence of Montesquieu because Montesquieu did a double intellectual operation, which was, there are now in France free peasants, and in the past there were serfs de la glebe, exactly as nowadays in Eastern Europe and Russia there are serfs de la glebe. And according to Montesquieu, Eastern Europe and Russia expressed the past of France, and France can indicate the future of Russia, a general evolution. And this is where the idea of backwardness enters in. So in Montesquieu's story, there is a double divide, a divide between the past and present of France and the divide between the East and West of Europe. The East of Europe is the same as France in the past, which means something which is to us extremely interesting, which means that he used a logical time, a way to express a normativity. And my argument is that we will find this idea of backwardness down to Gerschenkron, which is extremely important. The divide east-west, north-south, beyond what is considered periodizations from historians. There is not an historical periodization. There is a logical time, a philosophical time, in which I want to show what progress is. So it's extremely normative. And this is extremely important. Now, the question of Russian backwardness in the 18th century was not just serfdom. It entered a broader discussion about freedom. So backwardness and progress were related to freedom. And in the debates about Russia, there was not just serfdom once again, but serfdom was actually in France an argument to discuss of something else, to discuss of slavery in the French colonies and to discuss labor and guilds in France. So Russia was an excuse, even if people were interested in this, but the stake was not just Russia, was France and its colonies. And the argument was that there is one general notion of freedom which can bound together Russia, serfdom, slavery in the colonies, and guilds in France. These are three expressions, according to the authors, of unfree labor. So it's one single notion of freedom. But within this notion of freedom, there are differences. And so again, it's like Montesquieu. Some nations are more advanced towards freedom than other nations. And that's why they insisted, even if in France we have guilds, the Enlightenment can abolish guilds and we move towards freedom. In Russia and in the colonies, in the French colonies, is not the case. So there was an idea of freedom, which again was absolutely normative. And this is why we have people that you know better than me, like Voltaire or Diderot, extremely interested in Russia, and they wrote about Russia. They spent time in Russia precisely because they consider that the so-called enlightened absolutist monarchs could understand the reason as developed by the philosophers. So it was their dream of the knowledge orienting politics. It started at this moment, and they were extremely happy to spend time in Russia, but also those guys, in particular Voltaire, but also Diderot, they added something. Because they were at the court, they insisted that in Russia, it was not possible to have immediate reforms and abolition of serfdom, but it must be very gradual. In order, precisely because Russia was backward, you cannot have a sudden change, but you have long-term reforms in order to reach modernity and the progress. And to me, this is important because too much time we had a lot of, for a long historiography, opposing Enlightenment in France and Enlightenment in Russia, with ideas that the Russians didn't understand the real Enlightenment. The problem is that, as I argue, there were several contradictions in the French Enlightenment authors themselves. So it was not such a misunderstanding by the Russians, but Diderot and Voltaire with the profitability of serfdom or slavery in the short term, and the necessity of defending private property, and the necessity of having a long-term evolution of slavery and serfdom. In principle, they wanted to have free people, but they want a very long gradual transformation of it. And this is why it's they were correctly read on the Russian side. When you look at Sherbatov, but many others, they correctly repeated what Diderot and Voltaire argued. They were not so limited, and they insisted on the fact that serfdom, for example, was bad, but that you need a very gradual transformation of it. So it's important because this gradual transformation, non-revolutionary transformation, was, according to them, a way, the correct way for escaping backwardness. The escape from backwardness could not come from a sudden change, but from long-term changes. This was the argument. And this was the argument that was also important in the German economists living in Russia, in particular Stork, but also some of you know that Desnitsky and Tretiakov studied in Glasgow, in Edinburgh with Adam Smith, and they provided good interpretations of Adam Smith. In other words, Desnitsky insisted on the role of a moral sentiment, and Tretiakov insisted on the lectures on jurisprudence of Adam Smith. Both of them correctly interpreted Smith, who was not the Smith that we know nowadays, the Smith of the wealth of nation. The Smith of the wealth of nation actually was a Smith of the 19th century. In the end of the 19th century, Smith insisted much more, and there is a lot on him, on the jurisprudence on one end, on the moral sentiment on the other end. So when Desnitsky and Tretiakov insisted on these points, again, they provided the correct interpretation of Smith, as many others did in Western Europe as well at that time. We still are during the last quarter of the 18th century. But as a consequence of this, Stork also added something a little bit different. Stork insisted, as many others, on the gradual abolition of serfdom and the graduality of reforms. But Stork added something new, which was not in Smith, which was not in Desnitsky and Tretiakov. Desnitsky and Tretiakov wrote immediately after Smith. So we are still in the 70s and 80s of the 19th century. Stork wrote in the beginning of the 19th century, and he did something new. He added the German cameralism on Smith. And so the invisible hand became the visible hand of the state, which was a particular interpretation of Smith, very different from Smith itself. But it's important that this German presence and cameralist presence in Russia, in the way the political economy and Smith were interpreted in and diffused in Russia, with the role of the state helping to transform. So there is a very long story going down to Gerschenkron. So we have Stork in this interpretation of Smith, which is a very peculiar, is not specific to Russia, but it was specific to the Russian-German-Prussian connections and the role the Prussian economist played in Russia. There is also something more which intervened at this time, and it was something which happened in the West in the 19th century. And this was the 18th century, as I already mentioned, were a little bit ambiguous about slavery and serfdom, and the Russians were completely in from this perspective. But there was something also different, which happened in the first at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, and then until the 30s. The debates, in this case, was not just France, but also Britain. You have many debates about who is the real slave. And this is extremely important. And this is not to say me, Alessandro, that the proletarians were slaves, but how many actors of the time argued so. In other words, you have many actors, and they were who? They were not just the planters. There were some abolitionists and some people close to the labor unions, even if in principle they were forbidden, there were unions, and the many labor unions at the end of the 18th century and much more in the 30s, when we moved to from the abolition of slave trade to the abolition of slavery, it's the 30s, they insist on the fact that the real slave is the proletarian and that you should start from this. So when you argue that the real slave is the proletarian, you have, first of all, again, in Western Europe itself, a paradoxical convergence between some slave owners and some labor unions. And this same argument, again, was raised by a so-called Christian socialist. Some of you maybe know him, he's called Le Play, and Le Play argued the same. Le Play is very well known because he published a long series of the budget of the European workers, okay? And is very well known even nowadays because the Russians and statisticians in Russia were inspired by him when they invented the time budgets and the budget of the households and the Zemstvo budget of the households at the end of the 19th century. So Le Play was important, but the supporters and fans of Le Play don't like to remind something a little bit ambiguous in Le Play. Le Play, as a Christian socialist, was among those who argued that the real slaves are the proletarians. He insisted on this. He was in France among those who said, as in Britain, that the proletarians were slaves. But Le Play did more. Le Play lived as an engineer for a couple of years in Russia. And he wrote many letters to her sister, and he argued that serfs lived so well and so better than the French workers that they were in such a wonderful condition. So why do we want to abolish serfdom if they are so well? So again, we have a very important ambiguity on the West side about what is progress. And this is important to me because in this case, the notion of backwardness becomes very blurred. And this is a long tradition. I remind you that even in the 18th century, there were authors, not Voltaire and Diderot, but Rousseau and others who argued that the young nations were better than the old nations, that Russia and the US were the future of humanity because people were free there, because they were savage and they were young. And again, we find those kind of attitudes in the 19th century, when people like Le Play say, look at Russia, they live so well. The worst is the urbanization and the proletarization. This is the bad story, and this is not progress. So he tries to completely reverse the notion of progress and backwardness. The real progress is Russia, is not the proletarization. This is backward. So it's extremely interesting, this reversing, and this comes among socialist milieu, not just the so-called liberal or others. This is just the opposite. We find a lot of identification between proletarians and slaves among the socialists, not among, and socialists from these points of view converged with some estate owners. And this is an extremely interesting connection from this period of the 19th century. This kind of socialism intriguing and fighting against the urbanization and industrialization as the real evil and the backwardness of humanity. So, because of this, there is something which must now to introduce, and of course it's Marx, because Marx entered this debate and said, okay, those people, utopian and Christian socialists, they criticize the proletarization. But as you know, for Marx, proletarization is not backwardness, it's the future of humanity. So we need it. But this is interesting because you know better than me the connections between Marx and Russia. So I'm not entering into details for this, but what we need just to say is that, as you know, the idea of progress and the law of development, Marx was absolutely positivist and he wanted universal laws of development. So for many years, as you know, he insisted on the fact that proletarization was progress and that backwardness was the lack of industrialization and proletarization. But as you know, he also changed his mind and he had doubts on this. And the doubts came from two places, India and Russia. You know about Russia, but he did the same about India. On India, as a reporter, first he wrote in the early 50s that the British were bringing progress, and he changed his mind, and this is important, in 57 after the Sepoys rebellion. When the Sepoys organized a very important rebellion which changed completely the organization of the British Empire, in particular the role of India, the passage from direct rule to the indirect rule, and India as a Raj and not just as a colony. It was also the moment when the East Indian Company was disbanded and the crown took the place. I mean, the Sepoys rebellion was absolutely crucial to the British Empire. It changed after it. And Marx saw something very different. He saw that Indians could make a revolution. He didn't understand anything about this, but anyhow, he saw a revolution in the Sepoys. And so he concluded that maybe a different path to modernity was possible. So he started from India and then he moved to Russia with the same argument that you better know if the commune was the past or the future of Russia. But before Russia, there was India, which played a role. But this is where the translation of Das Kapital played a role. Why it played a role? Because, as you know, on the Russian side, the debates in the 50s, 60s about the option on the commune was not just a problem of rural or non-rural, was a debate, I'm not entering into details here, there was a debate also on how do I compare? Mikhailovsky, Chernyshevsky, and many others, when they wrote on this, they wrote also on how do we write history? How do we write social history? And history is like natural sciences or not. This was the crucial debate, and we cannot separate these epistemological questions from the questions about the commune. The two were absolutely related for all the authors of the 50s and the 60s. So to me, it's extremely important to stress this. But so if we do that, we also need to know how to translate Das Kapital. Why we know this? For a simple reason that the translators of Das Kapital had a problem, as Struve wrote after the publication of Das Kapital. The problem was whether in Russian we have to have a specific language for political economy, or if political economy must use common language. This was a huge debate at the time, precisely because it moved from this debate, they moved into the role of political economy, if it must turn into something that later will be called economics or not. And this is where the translation of Das Kapital enters in. Why this is important? It's important first because before the Russian translation, or during the Russian translation, there was the French translation. And the French translation was very different from the British version, because Marx added many passages in which he added his considerations about India and Russia. And he added the possibility of different paths of development. In other words, the idea of progress was not so clear as in the English version, because now we have the Indian paths of the Russian path. And this was the French translation, and Marx added himself these passages. But the French translation, unfortunately, is not very well known, because immediately after, and Marx was still alive, Engels argued that there were a lot of mistakes in this translation. And it attributed to the French translators, not to Marx, the added passages. So according to Engels, this story of possible other development paths was a mistake made by the French. But in the letters between the French translators and Marx, we see that Marx added the passages, not the French. Anyhow, the most important to Engels was to keep universal laws of development. And this is where the Russian translation entered in, because there was already this ongoing debate concerning France and the French translation, the multiple paths of development, and therefore the multiple possibilities of having progress in economics. And there we have the Russian translation. And the Russian translation had this problem, as Struve wrote a few years after. How do we translate Wert? And there were different possibilities, Zien or Stoimos. Now, if you use Zien and Ziennost, is what Marx called value. But in the language of the time, Stoimos meant not just value, but also cost of production. Now, for the non-economists and for the non-Marxists, this doesn't mean anything. Actually, it was extremely important, because according to the translation, if I say this just for the younger generations, for my generation was, everybody knows this, but anyhow, if you say that value is the cost of production, this was the so-called revisionist interpretation of Marx. In other words, you don't need the revolution, you need some kind of unions, and the value of any good is not just labor, but also capital and rent. So you can add the cost of production. If you say just Ziennost, no doubt there was value and labor. Now, the problem was that in many passages on the Russian side, Wert was not translated with Zien, but with Stoimos. And this is where some so-called revisionist, by Lenin, of course, it was later. This is the old Jane topic, one of the first Jane topic, but it's okay, she knows better than me. Anyhow, what they became the so-called revisionists, and this is not by chance, Struve and Bulgakov insisted that this was an absolutely perfect translation, because of course, they insisted on the fact that value was not just labor, but also capital and the cost of production. And that's why Lenin accused them of being revisionist and misunderstanding Marx. But the problem was already in the translation. And this is extremely interesting, because over the years, so we cannot do it, but over the years, there were different versions of the translations of Das Kapital with Stoimos or Zien, according to the main politics that you want to have, in particular in Soviet Union. In other words, during the war, communism was much more Zien, and when Stalin decided that the redistribution, that socialism is not communism, and so on and so forth, as you know, the Stoimos story came back, precisely because it was no more now a revisionist, or revisionist had been disbanded, but 30 years after that, it could be rehabilitated, just the translation, without mentioning the revisionist, by Stalin himself, by saying, in socialism, we need Stoimos, and not just Ziennost. So this is a long story that one day should be written, but to me, the most interesting is that is that in this debate about backwardness, on one hand, you have a very ambiguous Western intellectual meditations on this. As I said, what is backwardness? They were absolutely divided. And on the Russian side, we had the same ambiguities, but just because there was such a circulation of knowledge with some specificity in Russia. But again, there was not out of the Western interpretation of this. So I already mentioned these stories about Bulgakov and the Marxists and populists, all were about this zakономерность, yes or not. So if you had the laws of political economy, or you have some different paths, the different paths that Gerschenkron will rehabilitate later. It comes from this. So to me, it's important because the intellectual operation that Gerschenkron did was to move into the Cold War this debate. He just jumped into this and he moved into the Cold War with arguing one path or multiple paths to development. But this was the debate at the turn of the century in Russia, and not only Russia, because as I said, in the West, there was the same debates if proletarians were the future or the past, and so on and so forth. But this is also important because precisely when in Russia you have these debates about revisionism and non-revisionism and translations of Marx, you have something going on the Western side, and this was first the so-called revisionists in Germany, and they were extremely related to the Russian one. Chronologically, actually, if we want to be honest, and again, Jane knows this, the Russian so-called revisionists wrote before the German revisionists and not the other way around. So the Bernstein story arrived after Bulgakov. But this is not the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is that the German revisionists, they entered into huge contact with so-called socialism of the chair and with the people like Schmoller. And people like Schmoller who insisted on the role of the state in reforming societies and the economy without becoming a socialist or a communist. Again, this is something that Gerschenkron knew extremely well. These revisionists and the Schmoller, as probably you know, is one of the leading of the so-called second generation of the historical school. The so-called historical school in Germany, they started with Liszt, they went on with the second generation, and the third were Max Weber and Zombart. In all those cases, they insisted on the fact that instead of having general rules in political economy and abstract economics, you should try to have a kind of mixture between history and political economy. They insisted on the role of history and on the bifurcation in history. Again, these are extremely important roots for Gerschenkron, connecting revisionism, a kind of socialism, multiple paths, and the role of the state. They are all there. The state was extremely important to Schmoller and to the second generation. Is not by chance if Max Weber himself reflected a lot on the role of the state. They were obsessed with the role of the state. But you also have, at this moment, the real diffusion of the welfare state in Britain, France, and Germany, precisely at this moment when the Russians were reflecting on revisionism. But on the West side, you have the welfare state. So again, it was a kind of European movement. And this is where something changed, and changed with the war. And this is not Jane, but much more a Yannis topic on this. We discussed many times when we were young. But again, it's with the war, something happens because it's not just the state, but there is a different word which is used by many activists and economists. And this is the necessity of Gasudarstvenost to re-establish the role of the state authority, not just the state. The debate, which was important when we were young, probably less now, but I will leave Yanni with this, is when this happened. I have the impression, but maybe we can discuss this, that even if the word was there in 1913, 1914, the real shift was after the February Revolution and in the summer of 17. In the summer of 17, because of the lack of food, because of the chaos, it was full of agrarian specialist economists who were there in the ministries speaking of Gasudarstvenost. In the summer of 17, Gasudarstvenost became the keyword. And this is extremely important because we are no more into the Lombard or welfare state and the idea of Gasudarstv. It's the idea of Gasudarstvenost, which is another story. How the reestablishment of the authority of the state, not just the state, can help on overcoming the chaos. It's a completely different story, and most of the economists, and this is not important that they were so-called populist or Menshevik, all of them were full of Gasudarstvenost. I don't find any difference from this perspective among those people. So almost all of them. And this is where they had to discuss, again, the laws of history, of course. And you know this better than me. What I want to focus on is that how the laws of history had to be thought after the revolution. But this, you know this, you know much better than me. Pokrovsky and many others debating about one path, multiple paths, if the Russian is the Bolshevik revolution can fit Marxist laws and so on and so forth. This is absolutely well known. What is more interesting is that the way these same discussions were made by the economists themselves. It was not just a problem of Pokrovsky, it was a problem of the several economists working in the Narkamsien, Ingosplan, and so on and so forth, on the well-known Groman and Strumilin, and again, was we have to catch up the West, how do we do? And this is the difference between the two guys I mentioned there, one insisting we should start from the past, and the other we should start from the goals, as you know. And again, Gerschenkron knew perfectly well this story, and that's why he needed history. Because according to him, if I start from the goals, I become a sort of Stalinist. This was his idea. And if I start from so-called history, I can have a role of the state, but respecting the organic equilibrium of the society and the economy. This was utopia. So it was a vision coming from the so-called genetic development theories. They were called the genetic and the other teleological. Anyhow, much more close to Groman than to Strumilin. And Gerschenkron knew the two guys, and that's why he insisted on history. But again, it's a notion of history absolutely normative. It's not the history as we know them today, it's the history as Marx had thought, or even Lenin, or even before them. During the Enlightenment, it was the notion of history that we find in Montesquieu. It's an history to prove a philosophical argument, and to prove and to sustain a normative argument. We need to adopt those politics, and I take history as an example. It's extremely important because this is the way also Gerschenkron understood the story, okay? But again, we need another piece, because in the interwar period, there was not just the idea of Russian Soviet Union catching up the West, and so the idea of backwardness, and how do we do? There is something going on in the West itself, and this is the new philosophies of history insisting on the decadence of Europe. Spengler was extremely widespread, and it was translated into Russian, and there were dozens of comments on Spengler in Russian, precisely to debate about the decadence of the West and the future of the East. And again, this is what a long inheritance of what we had found in the Enlightenment about what is the future. Is Asia the future of Europe or the other way around? Spengler was obsessed with Asia and insisted on the idea that because of the First World War, the decadence of Europe had begun. And this was the same idea of decadence was extremely discussed in Soviet Union, progress and decadence. And this is the missing point and the missing connection for the debates during the Cold War between the development of Russia and the communism and so on and so forth, and the idea of decadence of Europe. The two were related and they converge into Gerschenkron. And the third point that I need to stress here is not just the debates in Soviet Union and the debates about decadence, it's also the explosion of the empires and the so-called, I call it the economist diaspora. If you look at the names of many economists in the United States, I'm coming back in a moment, not just Gerschenkron, all those people were first of all connected between Vienna, Berlin, and some parts of Russia in the 20s. It's not by chance that you find many well-known names publishing together into German journals. And Polanyi, Ayanov, and Weber were all the time together with Schumpeter and Alfred Weber. So there was a strong connection which insisted on what? That political economy had to be related to philosophy and anthropology, but absolutely not to mathematics and economics. It was a strong tendency in all around the Middle European and some Russians discussion, the way we practice political economy. And they insisted on this. And also, we cannot explain the, we should relate one day these debates in the 50s and 60s with so many people who had escaped from the former Austro-Hungarian empire, from Germany and from Russia. If we mention all the time Gerschenkron, but if you look at the names of all the others, they're all from there. They met one the others, but also they came from this Middle European and Russian milieu of political economy. And in other words, the way political economy was developed during the Cold War owed a lot to the collapse of the European Central Empire, in the collapse of Tsarist Russia. Without the collapse of those empires, the history of political economy would have been completely different. All those people moved to Britain, some of them, but most of them moved to the States as a consequence of this collapse. And all of them insisted on what is economics is not what is political economy is not economics. They insisted on the role of what they called history in writing political economy. And they insisted, they were obsessed with the idea of the laws of development, and they were obsessed with the idea of progress and backwardness. The European barbarians of Hitler or Stalin, they were all obsessed with this when they moved to the United States. And this is where Gerschenkron enters in. So, to a given extent, of course, economic backwardness in historical perspective is a kind of contradiction in terms. Why I say so? Because economic backwardness, I insist, is a notion based upon a logical time. It's a normative expression. You have an economic model and one single scale of time, and you can judge if some countries are in which part of this line. So some are back and others are more advanced. So there is a logical time, but the second is the idea of comparing. You can compare Russia to Britain. And this is also a very common approach of the time. We know Weber for this, but Gerschenkron did the same. This Weberian comparison of ideal types. We really use history not to enter into complexity, but to have ideal types to compare. When Gerschenkron compares Russia, Tsarist Russia, to Britain, he doesn't compare historical realities, even if he thinks so. He compares ideal type, an ideal type of capitalism, exactly as Marx did before him. I have an ideal type of Britain, and this is capitalism. I have an ideal type of Tsarism, I have an ideal type of this and this. So history is required to sketch ideal types in a logical time. And second, or third, Gerschenkron also does multiple anachronism. First, the first anachronism is the sources. He made use of Zemstvo statistics or Russian statistics, of course, without questioning and not for 1 second how this data had been made. This was not a problem to him. He was not interested in this. As an economist, he was not interested in sources. He was interested in data. So he took the figures and he used. But this is important because it means that in development economics of the 50s or the 60s, the question of how do I build up statistics, how there are ideologies behind statistics was not a problem, not at all. So they ignored, they didn't want to know how Lenin or any other populist statistician could have built the data. They were interested in picking up the data, that's all. But this is important because they did the same when they discussed about Central Africa or Latin America. They didn't care about the origin of the data. They were much more interested in the way I treat data after I had from one organization or another. It was a statistical question and not a question of discussing a source. So the discrepancy between a source and the data was extremely important at the time. But there's also something else. Gerschenkron, but also all the others, they translated, they moved something in time. In other words, they used again their idea of backwardness and moving along time to say that I can use the debate in Russia at the turn of the century to discuss underdevelopment nowadays. So this is extremely important because the Gerschenkroниan can, of course, reply that Gerschenkron imagined the multiple paths of development, which is true. Gerschenkron was closer to the old Marx than to the universal laws of development. Absolutely, yes. But it's also important that the alternative comes from the state, not from a civil society. It comes from the Gasudarstvenost, not from the Общественность, which is extremely important. Gerschenkron didn't believe in the Общественность for multiple reasons, for different reasons. He came from a decaying empire. Anyhow, he didn't believe in the Общественность. And that's why he could have found many substitutive factors to say there are not universal laws. But he picked one actor, and this was the state, not anyone else. So this is extremely important. And this means to me that even if we have multiple paths of development, we still have an idea of logical time and political economy as a normativity out of the civil society, coming from above. And this is the dream of most economists. I would say all the economists, but okay, let's just give one chance. But I mean, for most economists, I provide some suggestions, and after politicians will follow my suggestions, and after I can change the society. It's very hard to find economists stressing the role of civil society, for example. They insist on the role of knowledge, on the role of the state, but not on the role of civil society. Civil society will come after. Even for Gerschenkron, we start with the state, and after civil society will follow, precisely because we lack a bourgeoisie. And there was no way of conceiving different solutions to have a civil society. It doesn't enter history. It will come after. But this will be extremely important. Why? Because it took also, of course, it was not just Gerschenkron, and we had, again, Beyond the Wall, as most of you perfectly know, and as many books proved during last years, there was a lot of communication beyond the wall between East and South and West, and the circulation of this knowledge. And of course, you have all those people interested in reforming, if possible, from above, but also the using of cooperatives, of agrarian. You have what I call the global Chayanov all around the world, the people mentioning Chayanov in the West, in the East, in the South, in the North. There was Chayanov everywhere. When I was young, I started from there, after all. But what happened? The question is, when we have people working on the agrarian side in Soviet Union, again, the debate was, what is backwardness and what is the future? Cooperatives, private property, the kolkhoz, what is backwardness? And again, there was a lot of ambiguity circulating between the East and the West about the relationship between forms of property, of ownership, and the idea of backwardness. It was extremely tense during those years. And with the perestroika, we have another step. There is something new happening with the end of Soviet Union. First, the perestroika. Perestroika for a couple of years was Chayanov über alles. Everybody liked Chayanov, but this ended very soon. After 91, the situation changed. Why? Because on the Western side, you have the overall success of a new approach called neo-institutionalism. And this is extremely important because with the neo-institutionalism, we have no more the debates as before between the transition from feudalism to capitalism to socialism. You have no more modes of production. You have something different. You have something which is called the market economy. Neo-institutionalists never speak of capitalism, for example. They speak of market economy and the cost of transactions. And you can use this in many parts of the world, including past Russia. There is no time at all. You can use the same model of cost of transactions to speak about Middle Ages, Russia and perestroika, and so on and so forth. Instead of so-called modes of productions or stages, you have something which is called forms of organization, different kinds of firms, different kinds of communities, and so on and so on, organizations, and not stages or mode of production. So we are out of the idea of backwardness because we have no more time in this case. So it's something which is completely new from previous period. In previous period, you have a lot among the economists of teleological time. So you used time to make normativity and propositions, if possible from above, changes from above, and I use time in my explanations. Now you have no more time. You have economists out of any time. And there are two other changes. In the 90s, as you remember, most economists and neo-institutionalist economists started from these premises to say, you remember the debate, with Russia and the Eastern countries, do we start with market or with democracy? They bet on markets. With neo-institutionalism is absolutely the way of thinking this among economists. I don't say that among other tribes there was the same, but among economists, Jeffrey Sachs on the other, we start with markets and markets will bring democracy. first change. And as you know, it was not such a success in Russia as in China. I mean, the historical experience did not confirm much that because you have market, you must have democracy. This is an important point because unlike the previous 2 centuries, you have a kind of bifurcation. I mean, what I stressed that was over 3 centuries, you have this fate connecting or disconnecting market and democracy, people supporting or people criticizing them. With last years, we have a strong disconnection, which is problematic for the both sides. The fact that in Russia or in China, you can have a lot of market without democracy is complicated for the previous 2 sides. It doesn't fit these models, and this is extremely important. And the second is that backwardness, it doesn't enter anymore into debates because the Cold War is over, but also all the debates about modernization are over, are completely over. With the end of collapse, after 3 centuries on debates on modernization, nobody uses more this term. They speak about globalization, but modernization is immediately related to time. Globalization is related to space. It's a different story. It's a completely different story. And people are interested now in China much more than in Russia. But there is also something which is different. The so-called politically correctness in economic values. And I will finish with this. Over 2 or 3 centuries, when you want to speak locally against the bad Eurocentrism or universality, you insisted on something which was close to economic anthropology, local values, local economic rationalities. If you want to criticize the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, you should stress until the 70s that they didn't understand Africa, they didn't understand Latin America, because there people thought differently. Okay, and this was not backwardness, was a different path. This was the politically correctness at the time. But after the end of the Soviet Union, and after discussions on the Great Divergence, the politically correctness of underdevelopment completely changed. First, nobody speaks now of underdevelopment because the problems of development and growth concern also the so-called advanced countries. So there is no more a specificity of the so-called South, first. But second, when you discuss with the new people who are interested in political economists, they say, listen, Sandro, are you sure that if you say that Africans are not interested in markets, there is not something a little bit racist hidden behind the mentalities in what you say? Why you should think that difficulties in Africa are related to economic mentalities and not to corrupted institutions? In other words, in the new interpretations, the problems are no more related to so-called economic rationalities. People think everywhere the same in economic world, but if you are politically correct, you don't say that Africans cannot understand the market. They understand, but the problem are the institutions. And as you know, you had also this approach in many neo-institutionalist approaches on Russian history. Think about Tracy Denison, for example, arguing that peasants did not think differently. They thought well, but economists didn't understand. And second, there were problems in the Russian institutions. And against, we had this overlapping of different times, using the past to explain the present with this one single world and no more economic rationality. And this is the end of the idea of backwardness. That's why we are out now of this story. And I think I will finish with this.
Thank you, Alessandro. That was a mouthful. Thank you. It covers a long period of time very well. The last part I thought was controversial and worth pursuing. But in the meantime, I'll start turning to people with questions. Now, Jane, this was a tribute to you in part. Did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Well, I think I'll hold off on the argument itself. It sounds to me like it's a book, Sandro, a book rather than a talk. I guess I just want to mention one sort of parallel discussion at the critical turn of the century period that where I think your argument is that this communication between European economists and Russian ones is so intense, but also breaks in a certain way. And I think this is just because I've been working on Eurasianism at the same moment. And I see how there is a great parallel with the Eurasianists of the 1920s, who were, of course, also obsessed with Spengler. And then with the idea of backwardness. And this is where I see Trubetskoy's text, Europa and Европа и человечество, as absolutely critical in an attack on Eurocentrism and on the idea of backwardness. And he uses this very explicitly in his text from 1921. His argument is basically that, again, it enforces yours in the sense that he sees time as absolutely critical. And he uses a very linear, very sociological and sense of time to say that Russia will never catch up. And Russia, all the non-European colonized areas and the Russians will never be able to overcome Europe's being ahead. And he uses this amazing metaphor, which I absolutely love. He's saying it's like a tall man and a short man running a race. The short man tries harder and harder to catch up with the man with the long legs, but he only tires himself out and falls down. So that was his image of Russia in 1921. But Trubetskoy, being Trubetskoy, takes a very philosophical approach to this, an explicitly political one, to say that the only answer to this is world revolution of the colonized against the European enemy. So I guess I wonder, would you see any overlap between his thought? I mean, you also have, again, people coming straight out of this nexus of incredible intellectual effort with Jakobson and Trubetskoy in Prague and Vienna. And I wonder if you see any connection between them and your economists.
Jenny, you are too strong as usually. So this is no, because this is the real the Eurasian story. Yes, it's mentioned, but it's still a blind spot in what I said, and this is great. So it means that when you come to Paris, we have to discuss a lot. No, seriously, you immediately picked up my blind spot, the connections with the Eurasianists, and eventually some imagined Asia and not just imagined Europe. I'm a little bit too much oriented towards the West, Russia and the West, but there is Russia and Asia, and this is absolutely crucial. I agree. Thank you, as usually. So I'm waiting for you in Paris because we need to spend time on this. I need that. Thank you, Jane. It's really, really crucial. When you were talking, I immediately pick up the point.
I'd seen some hands up and they disappeared. Does anyone want to raise a hand again? Right. Sandra, I have a question for you, which is more the entire aesthetic layout of what you're doing. So you're describing a lot of the schools of thought in terms of normativity, and there's a certain rigidity here, and I think that's part of your point. To classify, categorize, and put the right countries in the right place, both spatially and temporally, which is the same thing. As you make the case. And at the very same time, there was another argument which was less developed than what you said, which was ideas of value, notions of value. And it starts in part with Adam Smith. And the second part in particular is the one I'd like you to pursue, although both of them in terms of their rigidities. You know, the first part about temporal and spatial normativity is not at all fluid, and this is the problem, right? It asks you to put something where it belongs and leave it there. That's Platonic at best, and I, you know, which I find in some ways abhorrent. You know, stability, you know, truth and justice is putting things in the right place and keeping them there, and the keeping them there is part of what you're talking about. Value, though, is connected to this in terms of, again, its rigidities. So with Smith, you know, you read the original Smith, it depends how you read it and how you translate it, but it's there in the first chapter. You know, the value is labor, right? And that's it. Everything else is complications. Value is labor. And insofar as value is labor, wealth is infinitely expandable and everybody can be improved, right? Because all of us are touched by this magic of light, God, creation, whatever we're going to put it. All of us can produce more and better. And it's the Adam Smith, of course, nobody talks about today because everyone likes to go to the last part about cruelty and scarcity and whatnot. But it's in there. You know, Adam Smith is the Scottish Enlightenment. I mean, that's what the Enlightenment is. All of the cases that you enumerated, at least the way that you describe them, are also speaking in terms of scarcities as opposed to expansions. I'm wondering if you wanted to comment on that. Particularly when it struck me, particularly when you're speaking about the economists from the World War I era, when all of them are talking about how do we take a limited amount of resources and put them literally into the mouths of each of our citizens so they have enough to eat and don't die. And that's it, right? And from this, before you know it, you have central planning. How do we make sure that everyone has this norm of something? And that's it, we've achieved our goal, right?
No, thank you, Yanni. Again, on normativity, I follow you, but I am a little bit skeptical on one point, not on what you said, but about the lack of normativity in political economy. To me, there is no question that political economy always has, by definition, normative goals and normative ambitions. So this is not the point. It doesn't exist a political economy which is not normative. The problem is how normativity is expressed in the analytics, which is different. The normativity goals is one story. Normativity impact on the analytics of economics. Sorry for the non-economists, but this is extremely important, how normativity reaches. And first, and the second is for temporal and spatial questions, normativity with or without laws. This is very different. Normativity is always there, but there was a normativity with laws and the normativity without laws, and rather as a heuristic. The problem is when political economy is not only normative, but a normativity with laws. There are laws in the universe, laws in political economy. And the third shift, and this is related to scarcity, when normativity becomes when normativity is related to the notion of scarcity, which is not always the case. When normativity is related to scarcity, in the case of Russia at least, you have the Государственность story, which is one, but it's not always the case. And I think it's extremely important. In many cases during the Cold War, maybe Fred knows this better than me, for the South, the scarcity argument was not necessarily central in the debates. I'm not sure, that when we discussed about underdevelopment, they thought in terms of scarcity. So scarcity intervenes. It's sure that scarcity, it's another track compared to labor. But
who are we talking about, Sandro? Who are we talking about now?
Yes, we're talking about that. So it depends on the periods. I agree on this, but if you take, okay, we cannot start another talk, but we'll discuss again both of them. But again, but again, for Smith, I'm not sure the scarcity is the real argument, precisely because the moral economy of the 18th century, as you know, it was not the utilitarianism of the 19th century, and the moral values were related to the so-called just price and not to scarcity. It was a value for the equilibrium of society. The scarcity story intervenes later, first with the utilitarianism, second with the neoclassic, but precisely there was the bifurcation with labor and Marx, which was not a problem of scarcity. But the most interesting is, to me, when, again, if we want to be short, both scarcity and labor disappear from the screen. And if I should start just an hypothesis there, because thanks to you now I'm thinking of this, but I didn't think about this. If I should say the debates on value, they disappeared with the debates on the so-called underdevelopment. If you read handbooks of economy, until the 70s or the 80s, there were many books discussing value, a lot of books. It was ideological, but not only ideological, because scarcity, utility on one end and labor on the other were the way theories were constructed. But they both disappeared, and probably before the end of communism. It's something a little bit different. In my opinion, the collapse, but again, maybe Fred knows this better than me, the decline of scarcity and labor in development theories was much more related to the north-south stories than to the east-west, even if the two were connected. But this is just an hypothesis. But thanks to you, I should think about this. I mean, when scarcity and labor ended being a relevant question.
Well, how about Keynes? How about Keynes? Which doesn't, it should find a place here, I think, right? When you write the book, which I hope you do. Yeah.
Yes. No, but my idea yes, I don't know if I will be able to write the book quickly as before. This takes more time, but okay, I don't want to enter into details, but Keynes gave up what he called the first law of neoclassic, but not the second one, as you know. So one was about the demand and supply, and the other was about scarcity. He kept an eye on scarcity, and this is extremely important, precisely.
Well, he did, but his whole proposition was, you know, as the rest of the world is still talking about how do you distribute scarcity, he's talking about how you expand wealth, right? In a way that, yeah. Absolutely,
but he had difficulties in discussing the labor market. That's why he kept the second law of neoclassics, as he said, the labor related to the marginal productivity, the wage related to the marginal productivity of labor. He had a lot on money, and he added much less on the labor market. That's why people like Phillips and all the others, you know, the post-Keynesian, to a given extent, were able very easily to conciliate Keynes and neoclassical analysis of the labor market. On money story, it was impossible. They were really split. But the labor is a complicated story with Keynes.
I mean, it does enter the picture as consumption. It enters the picture of as consumption.
You know, which is story from the other side, exactly, from consumption and not from wages. This was the idea, exactly. In the wage labor, the wage market, the labor market was a complicated stuff to him. I mean, there was unemployment, and after I used consumption to solve the problem of unemployment. That's all. About the value, he was not interested so much in value in itself. That's the real point. It was not his main worry. But again, yes, the tension, scarcity, and labor, yes, it's a good point.
Okay, now we have two questions here in the chat. Shall I read them to you, Sandro?
Yes, go on.
It says, thank you for your great presentation, exclamation mark. This is from Zina Vasilieva. Don't you think that the discourse about bad/underdeveloped institutions is yet another iteration of the discourse of backwardness?
Yeah.
I think it's a fair question, yeah.
No, I agree. I agree. I didn't talk about this. It's not just economists in the empty sky. I mentioned just Gershon, but because I tried to talk about 3 centuries in 1 hour, I agree. The development institutions and people with the development institutions have to be put into the main stage, are absolutely central. But there are good books about the role of international or economic institutions, the role of the economist, and so on and so forth. But in this case, there is 2 things, in my opinion. One is to really write the good chapter on this, and we need details, and we need people, and so on and so forth. But this has, in part, already been done. The second is, how do we think of those people? And on this, we have different opportunities. Those people liked to show them all the time as opponents to ignorant politicians, all the time. But they never thought, these dear economists, they criticized all the time the bureaucrats, that's for sure. They were very Weberians, absolutely. But they rarely mentioned again how a civil society can enter this story. In other words, their pictures of underdevelopment was a tension between ignorant bureaucrats and enlightened economists. This was their fight because they worked there. But this means that there was a huge blind spot, how people intervene in this story. In their perceptions, it was just a conflict between them and the bureaucrats. All the rest doesn't exist. And I think it's important to take this into consideration, the role of economic institutions into the political arena. Where are the others? They live in a particular world and they think they make the world. The interactions between them, local population, I don't like to have these opposite worlds, but I see a little bit less works for these topics, a little bit less good works as for other post-colonial stories. In other words, in a lot of now histories, you have a lot of interactions between, you have no more the colonial state and local population as divided and so on. This is very banal for people like Fred and many others, extremely banal. Everybody knows this. And on the other hand, you have now a lot of publications about the economists and their organizations, and it seems as if the other side of Fred's story is not there when we discuss of the economist, at least in some recent works. So I take your point, but I would like to add a little bit more interactions between these conflicts inside the institutions and the rest of the actors over there who are a little bit in the backstage. It seems to me, if it's what you meant.
I have here another question from Hasharam, UC Berkeley. It's long, but I'll go right to the question. I wonder, though, if you might consider the possibility that modernization can itself have regressive as well as progressive effects, which I think is what you're saying, right? Yeah. Russian serfdom, for example, was largely a creation of the post-Petrin state. Harsha, are you here? Rather than a vestige of feudalism. If we abandon normative ideal models in logical time, what would we get? Backwardness is something more like unevenness produced by something like a world system. I'd be interested in knowing your own opinion on the matter as a global historian.
Yeah, the question of normativity. No, we are not left with many things. If we put out, to me, I agree, Asha, with you. I mean, normativity and backwardness are strongly related one to the other. If we miss one, we miss also the other, exactly what I mentioned. Normativity, okay, backwardness disappears at the turn of the millennium. But on the other hand, we still have normativity, but my idea is that normativity is always there, so this is not the point. The point is, which kind of normativity do we have after the end of backwardness. And to me, this is important. I mean, what is normativity nowadays in political economy? They don't speak anymore of backwardness, but they are still very normative. But they are normative in a neo-institutionalist way. In other words, no more time. We don't care about time, even logical time. We don't need time. We need space. Where do we do that? That's all. And which connections, and this is the new global approach, which is interesting because, again, Fred shown the relationship or the passage from the modernization all the time, globalization all the time, the shift from one paradigm to another, and both didn't explain much. Maybe the only difference is, even if time and space are related, maybe we could say that the modernization paradigm made use of logical time. The globalization is not so much interested in time, is much more interested in a spatialization of the discussion. Space is the entry, much more than time.
Sandra, I find that part of your argument very, very compelling and very interesting. It's something I need to think about a lot and digest. But I have a student right now who's writing on the structural adjustment programs for the Global South, which are introduced in this case by the European Union as it gives aid to the Global South, right? And in return for the aid, they have to basically shatter their existing institutions and reconstruct themselves according to one or another norm, right? And you're right, as you're speaking, I'm noticing this, that they're no longer using that binary of backwardness and progress, or advanced and backward. So would it be fair to say that, you know, whereas sort of the entire conversation about backwardness allowed for cultural relativism, this one aims to either not recognize it or obliterate it altogether. Would that be a fair way to put it?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because backwardness and relativism, I see a little bit more complicated. In other words, you have a kind of, okay, if you want to get out from the pure universal laws, so backwardness, you have a kind of relativism. That's for sure. You have a possible different paths of economic development, and this is relativism. But as you know, in the debate, it depends which kind of relativism we want to enter in. As you know, in global history, you can have the approach called the multiple modernities. You know, you have the modernities in the Islam of South, in the Indian South, and so on and so forth. And in this case, backwardness, it doesn't enter this way because it doesn't use so-called anthropological values in economics. Gerschenkron read Polanyi, but he never made use of people think differently. He just said we need, for example, state to compensate the lack of bourgeoisie, but he never entered this mentality story. So it's a peculiar relativism. It's not in economic anthropology or economic values, but just in historical paths. And this is important because it followed all the traditions that I mentioned of the 19th and early 20th centuries, where economic anthropology was not there. You have some economic anthropology, of course, in the 18th century, but then in the late 19th century, it's interesting because anthropologists started discussing about different forms of local rationalities and so on and so forth, but they insisted on the specificities of a local place and the necessity to avoid to think that all the world thought in the same way. So they insisted, and this was not Gerschenkron, absolutely not. So when we say relativism, it depends where do we put the relativism. You know, in multiple paths is not the same of multiple economic rationalities. Not necessarily. It converged in some cases, but in many others, there were different tribes and different approaches. And the changes in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, according to me.
Well, here's a good one from Maria Sidorkina. Alena Legineva still writes about corruption, quote unquote, and how Russian institutions fail the standards of modernity set by Weber. Is it not just like backwardness, just by a less archaic name? I think basically you would say yes. Yeah. And then a related one, I think it's related, from Anne O'Donnell. Has this development, I guess this latest stage in economic thinking and spatialization that you were speaking about, has this development not also been accompanied by a growing sense of the penetrability of quote unquote developed institutions by undeveloped, undeveloped practices, i.e. corruption? We are seeing this today, this very day, in discussions about how to levy sanctions versus Russia. Meaning to, I think you mean, Anne, in other words, to tackle corrupt individuals and corrupt institutions per se, as opposed to the country as a whole. Is that about right, Anne?
No,
yes, precisely. In the sense of what we're seeing, especially in London, and the discussions about how the UK will go about levying sanctions. And I mean, obviously this has been prominent for years now, but the penetration of British institutions by Russian wealth and associated practices of accruing that wealth.
Yeah, because whenever I'm looking for clean government, that's where I look to England. Yeah.
Well, precisely, but that's sort of what I mean. The piece that doesn't seem, I'm very interested in this latter part of your argument, but the piece that seems to me to be less explored are the ramifications of what you're saying for the developed side of the world. And if there is this increasing spatial interpenetration, it is going in both directions, right? It's not just a projection that has changed onto the global south. It is also in turn a way that we are now thinking about the developed institutions as incredibly fallible and broken.
But two things on what you say, small comments. The first is that, yes, the fact that now we have a crisis, that there is development or underdevelopment, even in the north, it's a new configuration of the story. So there are crises even in the north. But because of this, it's interesting that we don't speak, or they don't speak that much of backwardness. They speak, because it's not politically correct to say that you are backward, but you can speak of different rates of growth. So you are neutral. You have not a country more advanced than another, but if you have a slow rates of growth, you risk to have again an economic Spengler nowadays, the decadence of Europe, of the West, because of the slow rates of growth. So no more backwardness, but the argument is very close. In other words, the more advanced the risk to become the latecomers, but you don't use the same words. But this is important because it's not just a rhetoric, it's because you are no more in a story of one single time again. You just have a space with competition between areas with different rates of growth. It's another way of thinking of it, it seems to me. So again, it's space and the rate of growth will go together instead of backwardness and time. So, but the rate of growth, I think it's an important notion to add, and it replaces backwardness.
Alessandro, I'm not sure whom you are talking about when you say people are no longer talking about backwardness or proxies for backwardness. And all the time when people talk about Africa, or for that matter, African Americans in the United States, they're making cultural reference. For example, to family, to systems of kinship, the relationship in Africa, the relationship of kinship to landholding. One of the most common arguments about Africa is that because so much land is controlled by kinship groups and not by freehold property relationships, that's why Africa is poor. And this seems to me just another way of saying backward.
Yeah, as before for the previous question, the argument is the same. I agree. The only difference is that, is it just politically correctness or not? In other words, they don't use the word backwardness, and this is one story. It seems to me that on one end, you are right. it's the same argument as before. But at the same time, I have the impression that there is no more disconnection with temporalities. You speak of lack of property or kinship, and you say you have a less rate of growth. I'm not sure this means that you move and you have perspective for the futures as in the time of backwardness. Maybe, I'm not sure. We have to discuss about this. I think not, but I'm open to discussion.
Well, as long as one presumes that these properties can be changed, there is time there. Mm-hmm. And I'm also not convinced about your argument that globalization is so starkly differentiated from modernization. After all, globalization ends with inization, and that's a time concept.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Fred, it ends with what?
Inization. Ization is a time concept. Change over time. And both modernization and globalization are sharing a notion of a self-propelled process that unfolds over time. That is, there is a movement from being primitive to being modern. There's a movement from backward to being developed, from underdeveloped to developed. All of these notions have a sense of motion over time, which is built in to the vocabulary, and also built into ideas of how change is affected. If one wants to talk about modernization theory in its 50s and 60s, it was about change over time, being self-propelled and multidimensional. That is, family structure changed from extended to nuclear families, property relationships changed, government changed, status systems changed. All these things varied together, and they vary in a self-propelled way. That seems to me integral to a lot of thinking that does not separate neatly economy, politics, and civil society. The relationship seems to me much more complex than you're allowing it to be, and much more contested and variable in how this has changed over the last 60, 70 years.
Yes, Fred, yes and not. That time and space are always related, I agree. But I'm not sure that they are absolutely the same. If I start from time, or if I start from space, I'm not the same configuration. History and geography are related between them, but they're not the same fields. Absolutely not. And if I enter through space and if I enter through time, even if in space I have time, and even if in time I have space, it doesn't mean they are the same. So on this, we disagree. I think
we don't disagree, because I'm not arguing that they're the same thing. No, I'm arguing that the relationship is much more complex than you're allowing it to be.
It's okay, but I also think that complexity is not an explanation. It's just a description. I agree, everything is much more complex, but I would like to understand if and when there is some changes between the 60s or the 70s and nowadays, for example. If I say that nothing changes and there is also a different term from modernization to globalization, it's a point. Why not? I think that in the way we think economic progress or economic transformation, in the way we think the role of political economy, in the way the world is structured, I'm not sure that it's exactly the same. Even if it's complex, I think that it's important to say that beyond complexities, there are important differences between the 60s, the 70s, and nowadays. And the passage of the change of words from globalization, from modernization to globalization, is just not a change of word. There is something different. There are continuities, but I insist there are some changes. And even if we say that it's complex, I think that the changes are there. And that the fact of thinking without time, only on space, because we are into a neo-institutionalist paradigm, is not the same as before. It doesn't exist, a neo-institutionalism in this way. When people discussed in the 50s and the 60s, it's an approach which arrived which arrived later, and in this way they expelled temporalities from political economy and economics. And to me, this is important to understand how political economy is used nowadays, and this was different before. But we can discuss about this. I agree, complexity it's okay, but as I told you, to me it's not enough. I agree that it's much more complex, but even the Enlightenment was much more complex that I said before. But so what? I mean, if I say that everything is complex, I don't say anything. Enlightenment was much more complex, and after I can have a very expert on Marx who will tell me that the translations in Spanish and in Portuguese were very different, and Marx on the third was even different. I agree, I fully agree. But does this change the argument? I'm not sure. But I keep your point that for the last decades, this can change the argument, is your complexity. So I will think about it, but I'm not sure that I will stress so much complexity and continuities as you do. I see something really changing.
Oh, wait, so Jane, did you have your hand up?
Well, I didn't, but I'll say one thing. And that is putting together the remarks that both Fred and Alessandro just made. I think Fred's point was the ization ending of those two words, globalization and modernization, is what indicates process and over time. But to me, I think the critical question to ask when comparing these, either these terms or the decades that you're looking at, the kinds of decades of economic thought, is what or who is supposed to drive this process, and where changes are to be made. So in other words, the question of agency and the field of operation of that agency, those are the two criteria that I would use to distinguish these so-called processes and also descriptors of economic thought.
Yeah. Yes, I agree.
I think, I mean, we're actually coming to the end. Right. So, you know, Alessandro, I take at heart very much what you say, and I take seriously what you said toward the end. And there's room for more discussion. But one of the strengths of everything that you do is that you can think in the broad strokes, and you can think in the long term, as is your want, and you can raise the big issues. And I think this is always what's so pleasurable about listening to you speak, and of course reading your books. I did ask you in the very beginning, did you want to tell us which books you have coming out? Because there's like 13 of them right now. I think you use lockdown more effectively than most people. Did you want to tell us a little bit about the books that are going to be coming out now?
Yes, so the last one was a political book. It was a political book. The one, Capital Terre, just in French, was an idea of joining together in the environment and social inequalities, because I wanted to bring together in the French and Italian debate the green and the reds, but this is another story. So I tried to write a kind of economic history with the environment and the inequalities, all the two inside. This was a real, very, very political book, but it's working well with the teachers in the high school and elsewhere. I mean, I'm having fun in political debates. So this was very political. And after there are some, the very last are very methodological books that nobody will read because they are horrible. I mean, there was one that I tried to write about the global history of global history, just to show the connections between different historiographies since the 16th centuries, to show that there were global history and these different tendencies, you know, the comparison, the world, and all the different, the Wallerstein stories actually had long-term affiliations since the 16th century, and above all, it was important to connect some knowledge about history, social sciences, philology across the continents. And now just sent out a book that Jane and Fred read, the very first version, a book that even my wife cannot understand what it's about. Jane and Fred suggest me the title Tensions of Social History, which is after the global history of global history is the social history of social history. In other words, a stupid attempt about a topic that I started probably 20 years ago, about trying to overcome the opposition between sources and data. You know that in the humanities are much more opposed. So I said, where is this opposition from? And so I tried to make a kind of epistemological and social history of the archives, and an epistemological and social history of statistics, and to show that they are, after all, much more connected than we think today. But there was an old sentence of Anne-Laure Stoller, not in the book, not in a paper she wrote the beginning of the millennium, in which she was discussing the colonial archives, and she added half a page by saying, well, maybe the chronology and the way they are discussed and so on, they remind me discussions about statistics and the quantification of the world, and Mary Povey about the invention of the social fact and so on and so on. And she said, but one day I should think about this connection. She didn't develop this. So I was struck by this, and I tried to develop this connection. So this is what the book is about. I mean, the connection between data and sources over a couple of centuries. But it's a book for 4 readers, as you can imagine. So it's even
one of
worse.
whom is your poor wife.
My wife said that my wife was able to understand the previous book. She never read, but at least she understood the content. On this, she said, I don't even understand what are you talking about. But it's okay. So, I mean, backwardness, maybe I will have 5 readers, but the tensions of social history, if I go beyond the 2, Jane and Fred already done, it will be a miracle.
All right. Well, Sandro, thank you very much for presenting your lecture. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you all for coming. We have actually one of your colleagues coming on March 8th, International Women's Day. That will be Juliette Cadieux, who will speak to us about her new book about, well, basically about corruption in the Soviet Union. Right?
Physically coming to New York or virtually?
No, we're not allowed to bring people from abroad.
Okay. So I can see her. Okay.
We would have brought you, we would have brought her. I mean, that was the original idea, right?
Perfect.
So hopefully this will change soon, and we'll see you all in person. And we'll discuss, as we did 7 years ago, the French election. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Ciao. Ciao.